The envelope hit the kitchen table at 7:42 in the morning. Meredith Calloway didn't open it right away. She set her coffee down, looked at the return address, Hargrove and Sloan Financial Group, and left it sitting there while she finished her eggs. She was 64 years old. She had learned long ago that bad news waits just fine. Her granddaughter, Zoe, had called her 3 weeks earlier, crying so hard she could barely get the words out. Something about a contract, something about a clause she hadn't understood. Something about a man named Fletcher Dunmore who had smiled at her across a conference table and told her she was making the smartest decision of her life. Meredith had listened. She hadn't said much. She'd asked Zoe to send her the paperwork. Then she'd spent 11 days reading it. If you passed Meredith Calloway on the street, at the grocery store, at the laundromat on 5th, at the back pew of Mount Olive Baptist Church, where she sat every Sunday without fail, you would not look twice. Small woman, gray at the temples, natural, she never colored it, reading glasses on a beaded cord around her neck. Sensible shoes, the kind of cardigan with pockets that older women buy, because pockets are practical and nobody is watching anyway. She had retired 4 years ago from a position most people in her life didn't fully understand. Not because it was classified, because when she explained it, their eyes glazed over. Senior Contract Analyst, 29 years, U.S. Department of the Treasury, Office of Financial Research. She had spent nearly 3 decades reading the fine print that other people signed without reading. She had flagged clauses that became congressional testimony. She had drafted language that protected pension holders, homeowners, veterans with VA loans. Her name appeared in the footnotes of 2 federal regulations most people had never heard of, and that protected millions of them anyway. She retired quietly. No party. Her husband, Gerald, had died of a stroke 14 months before her last day of work, and she didn't feel like celebrating anything. She came home, unpacked her desk photos, put them on the mantel, and started making herself useful in smaller ways. She brought Zoe to the bus stop even though Zoe was 23 and thought it was embarrassing. That was Meredith Calloway. Nobody looked twice. That was exactly how she preferred it. Zoe had moved to Atlanta 2 years ago, with ambition and a business degree from Georgia State, an idea she'd been turning over since junior year. A small catering company. Nothing enormous. Corporate lunches, private events, weekend weddings. She was good at it. Word spread, she saved. She found a commercial kitchen space she wanted to lease and expand into. And then someone introduced her to Fletcher Dunmore. Fletcher Dunmore was 38 years old. Tall, good-looking. In the way men who sell things are often good-looking. Practiced, maintained, designed to make you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He ran a boutique investment firm called Hargrove and Sloan that specialized, he explained, in emerging small business development. He had testimonials on his website. He had a Rolex. He had an office in Buckhead with a view of the skyline and a receptionist who offered Zoe sparkling water before she even sat down. He offered Zoe a business development loan at terms he described as preferential and community-focused. She would receive $80,000 to lease and renovate the kitchen space. In exchange, Hargrove and Sloan would take a 15% stake in her business revenue for 7 years, with a buyout option at the end. Zoe read the summary page. She didn't read the attached 41 pages. Almost nobody does. She signed on a Thursday afternoon. Fletcher shook her hand and told her she was going places. 6 weeks later, an invoice arrived, not from the kitchen space. From Hargrove and Sloan, an administrative facilitation fee of $4,200. Not mentioned in the summary, buried on page 27 of the contract, subsection 8C. In language so compressed and recursive, it read like a legal Mobius strip. Zoe called their office. A woman named Sandra told her the fee was standard. When Zoe asked to speak to Fletcher, she was told he was in a meeting. When she called back the next day, she was told the same thing. When she emailed, she received an automated response, directing her to the client portal, where the invoice sat waiting with a due date that had already passed. She called her grandmother. Meredith listened to the whole thing. She asked Zoe to send every document. She said she would call her back. She didn't call back for 11 days. Not because she was slow, because she was thorough. On the 12th morning, she opened the envelope on her kitchen table. Inside was a letter from Hargrove and Sloane's legal department, informing Zoe that her account was now in default due to the unpaid facilitation fee, and that under the terms of Section 14(ba) of the agreement, the company was exercising its right to accelerate the loan, meaning the full $80,000 was now due within 30 days, or they would place a lien on her business assets. Meredith read it twice. She finished her coffee. Then she picked up her purse, her reading glasses, and a manila folder containing 43 pages of handwritten notes, flagged sections, and 3 separate legal references she had pulled from federal case law in the Treasury Department's digital archive. She drove to Atlanta. The offices of Hargrove and Sloane occupied the 14th floor of a glass building on Peachtree Street. The receptionist, a young woman named Kayla, based on her name tag, looked up when Meredith stepped off the elevator and smiled with the particular brightness reserved for people you do not consider a threat. "Good morning. Do you have an appointment?" "I do not," Meredith said. "I'm here to see Fletcher Dunmore. My name is Meredith Calloway. My granddaughter is Zoe Calloway, account number." She opened her folder, read the number from a sticky note. HC2247. You can tell him it's about Section 14. Kayla's smile didn't waver. She picked up the phone. A quiet exchange. A pause. "Mr. Dunmore is in meetings all morning, but I can schedule you for." "That's all right," Meredith said. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs and opened her folder. "I'll wait." Kayla looked at her. "It may be several hours." "I brought lunch," Meredith said. She pulled a small container of almonds from her purse. She waited 2 hours and 40 minutes. Fletcher Dunmore appeared at 12:15, walking through the lobby in a charcoal suit, moving in the direction of the elevator with the focused energy of a man who intends not to be stopped. He saw Meredith and slowed, just slightly, before resuming his pace. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, standing. She extended her hand. He shook it briefly. "I was told you're here about a client account. Our client relations team handles. Zoe Calloway is my granddaughter," Meredith said. "She signed your contract 6 weeks ago. You've now sent a legal default notice demanding $80,000 in 30 days over a fee that was not disclosed in your summary materials and is buried in a subsection that contradicts Clause 3A of the same document." Fletcher tilted his head. "I'm not sure this is the right place to." "Your lobby is fine," Meredith said pleasantly. "Or your office, either works." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not alarm yet. More like mild irritation, the kind a man feels when a parking meter expires before he expects it. "Why don't you come back tomorrow?" he said, "and I'll have someone from client relations pull the—" "I've already pulled it," Meredith said. She held up the folder. "I've read the contract, all 41 pages. I've also reviewed the promissory note, the addendum filed on March 3rd, and the revision to Section 8 that was sent digitally but never countersigned, which means it has no legal standing." Fletcher went very still. A man who had been walking past them, older, silver-haired, carrying a coffee and a leather portfolio, stopped. He stood near the reception desk, not quite looking at them. "That's not," Fletcher started. "Section 14. Acceleration clause requires a minimum 45-day cure period before default can be declared on administrative fees classified under subsection C," Meredith continued. Her voice the same steady register it had always been in boardrooms and conference calls and congressional briefings. "Your letter gave 30 days. You are out of compliance with your own contract. Additionally, the facilitation fee itself is potentially unenforceable under the Georgia Fair Business Practices Act, specifically OCGA, Section 10(1)(393, which prohibits undisclosed fees in consumer lending transactions." The lobby was quiet. Kayla had stopped typing. Fletcher laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "Ma'am, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is a complex financial document. I think what might be more productive is having your granddaughter sit down with an attorney who can explain." I am her attorney, Meredith said. Which was not technically true, but it was also not technically the point. What she said next was the point. My name is Meredith Calloway. I spent 29 years as a senior contract analyst for the United States Treasury Department. I've reviewed the terms of approximately 6,000 financial agreements in my career. I've been cited in federal regulatory guidance regarding undisclosed fee structures in private lending. I'm familiar with this type of contract because I spent the better part of a decade helping write the regulations designed to prevent it. The silver-haired man near the desk had gone completely still. He set his coffee down. Fletcher Dunmore's smile had not moved, but it had changed in the way that smiles sometimes change. The muscles still holding the shape, the warmth entirely gone. What is it you want? He said. My granddaughter's contract dissolved. The facilitation fee waived, the $80,000 returned, less any reasonable administrative costs she actually incurred. And I'll need itemized documentation of those, and a written confirmation that her business credit has not been reported to any commercial bureau. That's not something we. If you prefer, Meredith said, I can file a complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau by end of business today. I can copy the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance. I know several people there. I also have a call scheduled this afternoon with a reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who covers predatory lending. She paused. She's been looking for a feature story. She was bluffing about the reporter. She had emailed one. The response was pending. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the silver-haired man, who was watching the whole exchange with an expression Meredith recognized. The expression of someone calculating very quickly. Why don't you come to my office? Fletcher said. His voice had a different quality now. The performance was still there, but thinner. Meredith picked up her folder and her purse and followed him. She did not look back. The silver-haired man watched her go. He picked up his coffee. He went back to his office and closed the door. Meredith Calloway sat across from Fletcher Dunmore for 2 hours and 17 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She did not threaten. She did not plead. She laid documents on his desk, the way a hand of cards gets laid on a table, one at a time, face up, unhurried. The unsigned addendum, the cure period calculation, the federal citation, a printed summary of the CFPB complaint form, with the relevant section already highlighted. She had printed it at the library before she drove to Atlanta. By the second hour, Fletcher had called in a man named Douglas, who was apparently the firm's in-house legal counsel. Douglas read through Meredith's notes for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he pulled Fletcher aside and spoke to him quietly near the window. Fletcher came back to the desk. We're prepared to offer a full dissolution of the contract, he said. Administrative fees waived. A return of the origination funds minus $2,000 in documented processing costs. Itemized documentation of those processing costs, Meredith said. A pause. Yes, Douglas said from the window. And written confirmation, on company letterhead, that no adverse credit reporting has occurred or will occur. Another pause. Yes, Douglas said again. Meredith closed her folder. Then we're done here, she said. She shook neither of their hands. She drove home that evening, listening to the radio, a program about restoration of old homes, people peeling back layers of wallpaper to find original plaster underneath. She stopped at a drive-thru and got a coffee. She called Zoe from the parking lot. It's over, she said. Zoe was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that was trying very hard not to break, Grandma, what did you do? I read the contract, Meredith said, the whole one. She got home at 9. She put the folder on the kitchen counter. She fed her cat, a large orange animal named Prospect, who had been Gerald's idea and had outlived him by 6 years. She sat in the chair by the window. Gerald's chair. Still, she thought of it that way. And she looked at the streetlight outside for a while. She hadn't told Zoe everything. She hadn't told her about Douglas's face when he read the notes. The way his jaw tightened on the second page. The way he looked at Fletcher, with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, but somewhere in between. She hadn't told her that before she left the building, Douglas had caught up with her at the elevator and pressed a business card into her hand without saying anything. On the back, in handwriting, he'd written, "There are others, if you're willing." She had not yet decided what that meant, or what she would do about it, but she had the card. 3 days later, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter called her back. Her name was Sandra Park. She was 29 years old, and she covered financial regulation and consumer protection, and she had been trying for 8 months to build a sourced story on Hargrove and Sloan because she had 6 people who had experienced similar contracts, and none of them had documentation solid enough to go on record. Meredith had 43 pages of notes and a background in federal contract law. They talked for 2 hours. The story ran on a Thursday morning, 41 days after Zoe had first called her grandmother crying too hard to speak. It ran above the fold in the business section, with a headline that was straightforward and quiet and completely devastating. Small business owners say Atlanta firm buried fees in contracts. A former Treasury analyst says the math doesn't add up. Meredith's name was in it, with her permission, her title, her career. 2 sentences about her granddaughter's case, anonymized as she'd requested. The Georgia Department of Banking and Finance opened a formal inquiry that same afternoon. The CFPB flagged the story and requested documentation from Sandra's editor. Douglas, the in-house counsel, resigned the following Monday. Fletcher Dunmore did not resign. He gave a statement to a local news station expressing his confidence in the firm's practices and his commitment to the business community. He wore a very nice suit. He looked directly into the camera. The comment section under the station's video was not kind to him. By the end of the second week, 11 former clients had come forward with documentation. 4 of them had lost businesses. 2 had filed for bankruptcy. One woman, a baker named Loretta from Decatur, had been trying to get out of her Hargrove and Sloan contract for 2 years and had stopped believing it was possible. Meredith spent a Saturday afternoon on the phone with each of them. She didn't promise anything. She just listened, and then she told them what she saw in their paperwork, calmly, clause by clause, the way she had done thousands of times in a career that most people never knew she'd had. On the 4th Saturday, Zoe drove up from Atlanta. She knocked on the front door even though she had a key. Meredith always thought that was one of the better things about Zoe. She knocked anyway. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the envelope had landed 6 weeks ago. Zoe had brought pastries from a bakery she'd started supplying out of the kitchen she now legally, fully, and unencumberdly leased. She looked at her grandmother across the table with the expression Meredith had seen on Gerald's face once, years ago, when she'd walked into a conference room at Treasury and taken apart a bad deal in front of 12 people who hadn't seen it coming. That look. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Zoe said. Meredith broke off a piece of croissant. "Tell you what? About all of it. The Treasury, the regulations, the..." She gestured vaguely at the folder still on the counter. "All of it." Meredith thought about that. She looked at Prospect, who had arranged himself on the windowsill in the particular boneless way that cats have when the sun is exactly right. "I didn't think it came up," she said. "Grandma, you never asked about my job. I thought you did paperwork." "I did," Meredith said. "Important paperwork." Zoe stared at her. Then she laughed. Sudden and real. The kind of laugh that spills out when you've been holding something too tightly. She laughed until her eyes watered, and she had to set down her coffee. Meredith watched her, and she felt something that had been clenched for 14 months. Since Gerald, since the desk photos on the mantel, since retiring into a quiet she hadn't quite chosen. She felt it loosen, just slightly, not disappear. Just loosen. The inquiry into Hargrove and Sloan concluded 4 months later. The firm was ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to former clients, dissolve all contested contracts, and submit to 2 years of regulatory oversight. Fletcher Dunmore was fined personally and barred from operating any financial services entity in Georgia for 5 years. The story was covered by 3 national publications, Meredith was quoted in all three. One of them, a financial industry newsletter, read primarily by people inside the business, ran a short profile on her in their winter issue. The editor called her old school, which she considered a compliment. The photo they used was the one Zoe took on her phone at the kitchen table, Meredith with her reading glasses on, the folder open, prospect visible in the background, ignoring everyone. She didn't print it out, but Zoe did, and framed it, and put it on the wall of her commercial kitchen next to her business license. The following spring, the Georgia Department of Banking and Finance called Meredith with an unusual request. They were developing a new consumer education initiative, a series of workshops designed to teach small business owners how to read financial contracts before signing them. They needed someone who could translate complex legal language into plain English. Someone with credibility and patience and the particular skill of making difficult things understandable without making people feel small for not already knowing. She said she needed to think about it. She thought about it for one afternoon. She called them back the next morning. The first workshop was held on a Tuesday in March, in a community room at the Atlanta Public Library, 14 blocks from the kitchen space. Zoe now ran out of 4 days a week. 17 people came. Small business owners, mostly. A woman with a food truck. A man who repaired electronics out of a storefront his father had owned. 2 young women who had started a cleaning service and were about to sign a lease agreement they didn't fully understand. Meredith stood at the front of the room in her cardigan, the one with pockets, and set her reading glasses on her nose and said, "Here's what I want you to know. The people who wrote these contracts are counting on you not reading them. They're counting on the words being too dense, the paragraphs being too long, and you being too busy, or too hopeful, or too polite to ask questions. My job today is to make sure that stops working." She taught for 3 hours. By the end, the 2 young women with the lease agreement had found 2 clauses they wanted renegotiated, and knew exactly how to ask for that. The man with the electronics storefront said it was the first time someone had explained any of this to him in a way that made him feel capable of understanding it. The woman with the food truck cried, briefly, and apologized for crying, and Meredith handed her a tissue and said there was nothing to apologize for. At the end of the session, a young man who had said almost nothing during the 3 hours approached Meredith as she was packing up her folder. He introduced himself as someone who worked for a nonprofit focused on small business equity. He said he had sat in the back of the room with the specific intent of evaluating the workshop for potential partnership funding. He said he had 4 other sites across Georgia that needed this. He asked if she'd be willing to expand. Meredith thought about the kitchen table, the envelope, the 11 days she'd spent reading a contract that someone had designed to never be read. She thought about Zoe's laugh, sudden and real and full of relief. She thought about Gerald, who had known what she was capable of, even when she forgot, who had brought her coffee during long evenings of work, and asked her to explain what she was doing, and listened like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever heard. She thought about the cedar chest she didn't have, about the parts of yourself you fold up and put somewhere quiet when life calls you toward other things. How they wait, how they don't expire. She looked at the young man. She said, "Yes. I've been telling stories for a long time. Stories about people who didn't look like much from the outside. People the world walked past. People whose strength lived in places no one thought to check. Meredith Calloway is not a fighter. She never threw a punch. She never needed to. She walked into a glass tower in a cardigan with pockets, and she sat in a lobby chair eating almonds, and she waited. And then she opened a folder and laid the truth down 1 page at a time until there was nothing left to say except yes. That's what competence looks like when it's been waiting quietly for a long time. That's what it looks like when someone who spent 30 years protecting people nobody noticed finally gets to protect someone she loves. And that woman in the workshop who cried. She wasn't crying because she was weak. She was crying because someone had finally handed her a tool she didn't know she was allowed to have. So I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life who carries more than they show? Who has been moving quietly through the world for decades, being underestimated, being overlooked, and who could do something extraordinary if someone just said, "I see you. I know what you know." Drop their name in the comments. Or don't, but think about them. And if this story stayed with you, share it. Not because of the algorithm. Because someone you know might need to hear it today. Because standing up doesn't always look like a fight. Sometimes it looks like an old woman in sensible shoes, sitting in a lobby, eating almonds, waiting for the truth to do what it always does. Next week, I'm bringing you a story about a retired school librarian who uncovered something inside an old estate that changed everything for a family that had given up hoping. You don't want to miss it.